Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. From the end of 1823, when Newcastle ceased to be a place where reoffending convicts were sent, the Hunter Valley opened up to free settlers who eagerly sought land grants. As these pioneers of the area established their properties, assigned convicts were needed to work rural and domestic capacities. Landholders applied to the government for labour. This episode begins a sub-series of Felonious Females by Mel Woodford, where she takes a look at some of those early landholders and the female convicts who were assigned to them. Some women stayed with the same family for a lengthy period, while others moved on in a very short space of time. We begin with Henry Dangar, who surveyed Newcastle and the Hunter Valley in 1822-23, before taking up a number of substantial landholdings with his family.
Once Newcastle became the place of secondary transportation in New South Wales, from early 1804, we see a constant stream of convicts sent northwards. Most were male, but even from the very beginning, we see a small number of convict women also arriving in the settlement. A general muster on the 12th of July 1804, conducted by a young Commandant Menzies, revealed 55 male convicts and 5 female convicts. By the 30th of June 1805, a general statement of the inhabitants of His Majesty's settlement on the east coast of New South Wales showed 73 male and 18 female convicts being victualled or fed from public stores in Newcastle. We can discover which convicts were assigned to people in Newcastle and the Hunter Valley in a number of different ways. Their assignment details may be noted in the Newcastle Jail entrance books, when they were admitted or discharged. The various bench books provide useful information. The Government Gazette and the Sydney Gazette also list those who were assigned. Information may also be found in the Colonial Secretary's correspondence. Ancestry Australia has gathered together much of this information in its convict files. The Biographical Database of Australia also has a steadily increasing amount of this information on their website. All information has been gathered from primary sources and is readily available at public libraries, family history and historical societies, as well as your online personal subscriptions. Newcastle ceased to be a place of secondary transportation where repeat offenders were sent in December of 1823, when Port Macquarie assumed the role. Henry Dangar, Assistant Government Surveyor under John Oxley, was sent north in 1822 to survey Newcastle in anticipation of an influx of free settlers arriving after the departure of the convicts. Dangar had recently arrived aboard the Jessie in 1821 as the first of 6 brothers who would emigrate as free settlers to New South Wales. At the time, Henry was a single man and aged 24 years. Dangar painted a very rosy picture of the area. It was therefore unsurprising that so many settlers applied for land grants and headed north with such enthusiasm. Dangar's plan of Newcastle showed 9 streets and a market square, with the original street names replaced by new ones. It also showed Newcastle divided into 192 allotments, which were to be held on a 21-year lease by those who had received large land grants in the Hunter Valley. If a leaseholder chose to construct a building worth £1,000 during that time, the land became his. The names of the first leaseholders can be found in Huntington's History of Newcastle and the Northern District, a Newcastle Family History Society publication available from our online shop, or from Trove, or in the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate of Tuesday the 19th of April 1898 on page 7. Many of the names are well known to us, and many had numerous female convicts assigned to them over time. Because leaseholders could have a town allotment as well as their much larger land grant, we often find female convicts recorded as being assigned to well-known individuals and families in more than one location. We frequently find government officials who also had a large number of convicts assigned to them. Sometimes emancipists or freed convicts who had done well after receiving their certificates of freedom had convicts assigned to them as well. Researching those convicts who were assigned to various individuals over a number of years provides a valuable insight into life in Newcastle and the Hunter Valley during the first half of the 1800s. Dangar himself initially had a 700-acre grant, 283 hectares, near the town of Morpeth. He later spent time as a surveyor with the Australian Agricultural Company, the AA, at Port Stephens, where records show that Charlotte Tither was assigned to him in July 1831. At this time, Dangar's family consisted of his wife, Grace, and their infant son, William. Dangar had married Grace on a return trip to Cornwall in 1828. Charlotte Tither had arrived aboard the Princess Royal in 1829. She had been convicted at Warwick Assizes in August of the previous year for picking pockets and sentenced to transportation for life. Charlotte hailed from Birmingham and was a single housemaid aged 21. Upon arrival, she was assigned to Simeon Lord, himself a convict who had arrived in 1791. Lord became quite the entrepreneur and a wealthy member of Sydney society. Charlotte found her way to Newcastle Jail on the 26th of February 1831 for the purpose of being assigned. From there she was sent to John Palmer of Maitland in March, but things did not go well, and she was sentenced by the Maitland bench to 3 months in the third-class factory for insubordination and insolence, and was sent back to Sydney at the end of the month. John Meehan and Charlotte Tither applied to marry in Maitland in June of 1832, so she had been returned to the district after her time at the Parramatta Female Factory and prior to her assignment with the Dangars. John and Charlotte's application was refused, however, as John was known to be already married. Another application was made in August of the same year, this time in Newcastle, but between Charlotte and Thomas Nulty, or McNulty. An approval saw the pair wed. In between applications, Charlotte was assigned to James White at Ravensworth. Charlotte received a ticket of leave to stay in the Maitland area in 1843, but it was cancelled 2 years later as she was absent from the district. A further ticket of leave was issued for the Goulburn area in late 1846, and she finally received a conditional pardon the following year, some 19 years after her original conviction. By mid-1833, Dangar's services as surveyor were no longer required by the AA Company, and he retired to his property, Neatsfield, near Singleton, named for his birthplace of St Neots in Cornwall. It was a flourishing farm, previously managed for him by his brother William. Henry Dangar now concentrated on extending his farming interests. In May of 1836, Anne Armsworth was assigned to Henry's household, by which time Henry and Grace had 3 sons and a daughter. Anne arrived on board the Canes in 1831 with 1 child. She had been convicted at the Old Bailey the previous year for larceny, the theft of a shawl, and sentenced to 7 years' transportation. Her trial is well documented at the Old Bailey online website. The voyage of the Canes is also well documented by the surgeon Thrasicles Clark, and also available online. We find that a young sailor by the name of Charles Picknell kept a daily journal, which is available through the National Library of Australia in Canberra. All make interesting reading. Anne, from London, was 28 years of age and a housemaid and plain cook by occupation. A plain cook was responsible for cooking basic meals for the family, cleaning the kitchen, and helping with other domestic chores. Upon arrival, Anne was assigned to Thomas Ryan. However, some short while later, in August 1831, she was sentenced to 3 months in the Parramatta female factory for stealing. We find reference to a son, Henry, born to Anne on the 29th of March 1832 and baptised at St John's, Parramatta on July 1st. We don't hear of Anne again until May of 1836, when she is assigned to Henry Dangar near Patrick's Plains, now known as Singleton. Her time in the Dangar household is short-lived. She is soon sentenced to time in the cells and returned to government service for refusing to work. Anne is then assigned to Lieutenant Bedwell at Patterson, but is again soon before the bench of magistrates in July and sentenced to 12 months in Newcastle jail for assault. Her son Thomas is born in November of that same year, but sadly his death and burial, aged 5 months, is recorded in March 1837. Anne finally receives her certificate of freedom in Newcastle in July 1840, after a troubled decade in the colony. In December 1836, Hannah Mountford was assigned to Henry Dangar at his property outside Singleton. Hannah had been convicted of man robbery, or stealing from a person, at the Stafford Quarter Sessions in October 1833. She was sentenced to 7 years' transportation and arrived on board the Numa in June 1834 at the age of 21 years. During the voyage, Hannah received medical assistance from the surgeon Edward Ford Bromley for an abscess in the left breast, which caused her considerable pain and inflammation for almost a fortnight, with doses of opium being given at bedtime to help her sleep. The Sydney Monitor of the 2nd of July 1834 reported that a number of the women on board were sent straight to Newcastle via the steamer Sophia Jane on the evening of Monday the 30th of June for distribution amongst Hunter Valley settlers. It is unknown if Hannah was one of them. Hannah was described as a country servant and was first assigned to James Reed in Newcastle in November of 1836, but that same month she was sentenced to 21 days solitary confinement in Newcastle jail. Upon release, she was reassigned to Henry Dangar near Patrick's Plains. In turn, this assignment did not last long, as in January 1837 she was sentenced to 14 days in the cell as punishment for being drunk on a Sunday. It is unknown if she was returned to the Dangars following her imprisonment. We next discover Hannah assigned to the Reverend Threlkeld in Newcastle in January 1838. In September of 38, Hannah is again mentioned in an entry in Newcastle jail in the entrance book, convicted of insolence. Upon completion of this sentence, she is again reassigned, this time to Major Crummer, the police magistrate, in December 1838. We will hear more of Major Crummer and the female convicts assigned to him in a future podcast. In June 1839, we discover an application to marry John Lennon, who had arrived on the Hercules in 1830. This application was made in West Maitland. Hannah's certificate of freedom in 1841 names John as her husband. Hannah is free in 1845, but we find a second marriage in Maitland in 1846 between Hannah and Christopher Breeden, who had arrived on board the Albion in 1827 with a life sentence. It's another 12 years until we find reference to Hannah again, this time in the form of a jail entry for one Anne Braden in December 1858, sentenced to 7 days. Our final encounter with Hannah is an entry for Maitland Jail in December 1869, noting that she had been convicted for the 5th time of being drunk and she had received 4 months hard labour. By this time, Hannah would have been approximately 56 years of age. Henry Dangar retired to his property outside Singleton in mid-1833 and spent some years furthering his farming interests, as well as acquiring allotments and establishing inns and stores. He also pursued interests in Newcastle, which included a boiling down works and a meat preserving and canning works. Dangar was also a magistrate and a member of the district council. He actively promoted the Hunter Valley politically as well as agriculturally. He, like many large landholders, was always short of labour, and therefore supported transportation as well as the sponsorship of immigrant families. Henry himself sponsored immigrant families from Britain and later Saxony. The next female convict to be assigned to Henry Dangar was Anne Brough. Anne was 19 years old when she arrived on the Margaret in early January 1839. She had been convicted the previous year of stealing a quilt in her hometown of Limerick and was sentenced to 7 years transportation. Anne's mother had been convicted some 3 years earlier and was already in the colony. Like many of the female convicts who arrived in the late 1830s, Anne was sent straight to Newcastle Jail, where she was assigned at Patrick's Plains in February 1839. In May of the following year, Anne was sent to Newcastle Jail from Singleton, along with her infant child, as she was not considered able to attend to her duties as well as care for her baby. It was then that she was assigned to the Dangar family, in late June of 1840. We find an application to marry Emancipus Thomas Healy in November of that year, with the Reverend Bolton of Patrick's Plains named as clergyman. The final female convict that we know of to be assigned to Henry Dangar was Ellen Townsend, who arrived aboard the Henry Wellesley in 1837 at 33 years of age. Ellen was from Birmingham and had been convicted of housebreaking and sentenced to transportation for life. This was not Ellen's first conviction. Her convict indent identifies her as a widow and a laundress by trade. Ellen was first assigned to Mrs. Semple in Sydney upon arrival. At some stage she'd been sent to the Hunter Valley, as we then discover her in Newcastle Jail, having been sent there from Maitland in July 1841 for 14 days. It is from here that she is reassigned to Henry Dangar in August. Ellen would have worked for the Dangar household in the capacity of laundress and most likely also servant of all work. She did not remain long with the Dangars though, as we find her assigned to Mr. Carpenter in April of 1842. An application to marry John Penwarne, who had arrived in 1821 with a life sentence, was approved by the Reverend Ross of Paterson in March 1843. It is here that we lose sight of Ellen, sometimes recorded as Helen, in the records. However, John gains his ticket of leave for the district of Paterson in 1844 and is recommended for a conditional pardon in 1847. An entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography states, "The magnitude and complexity of his pastoral and business interests, combined with the incessant demands of public office and private affairs, at length exhausted even Henry Dangar's vitality, and he sailed for England and the continent in 1852, spending 4 years away. Upon his return he retired to his home in Potts Point until his death in 1861. He is buried in the churchyard of All Saints' Church of England in Singleton, where Grace joined him 8 years later. The lives of the women assigned to Henry Dangar reflect a wider truth about female convicts in colonial New South Wales. Each woman's story, whether of hardship, rebellion, resilience, or eventual freedom, offers us a glimpse into the realities of a system that sought to control them while relying heavily on their labour. Some, like Charlotte Tither, managed to carve out new beginnings despite repeated setbacks. Others, like Anne Armsworth and Hannah Mountford, struggled against poverty, loss, and the rigid discipline of the convict system. Still others, such as Ellen Townsend and Anne Brough, are only partly revealed to us through fragmented records, leaving their later lives largely hidden from view. Henry Dangar himself prospered, building his reputation as a landholder, surveyor, and community leader, his household frequently supported by the presence of assigned female servants. Yet, for the women who passed through his home, their stories were rarely ones of stability. Instead, they remind us of the precariousness of convict life, where freedom was always conditional, and survival often depended upon resilience, resourcefulness, and a measure of luck. In tracing their assignments, punishments, marriages, and the eventual freedoms, we see not only the lives of individuals, but also the contours of a society in transition, where convict labour laid the foundations for wealth, settlement, and expansion in the Hunter Valley. The female convicts, though fewer in number than their male counterparts, were no less significant. Their hidden contributions shaped households, communities, and the emerging fabric of colonial life. By following their paths through the records, we are reminded that history is not only about the landholders and prominent people like Henry Dangar, but also about those whose labour sustained them, and whose lives, however briefly documented, left lasting marks on the hunters' past.
You've been listening to Felonious Females, the podcast series that uncovers the forgotten lives of convict women in Australia's past. Today we trace the stories of convict women assigned to Henry Dangar, women whose resilience and hardship helped shape the Hunter Valley's past. Join us next time as we continue uncovering the lives of the women behind the records and the history they left behind on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.